All right, so I want to introduce to you 8 spiritual personality types that I believe have biblical roots for which no one else has ever talked about before. So what's up, guys? In this video, I want to introduce a framework that will help you evaluate your spiritual life based on 3 pillars to a relationship with God. So, a lot of people only have a very general understanding of the life cycle of spirituality with very superficial labels. In one season you can have a spiritual high, and then in another you can have a spiritual slump. And whatever that label is, it's a very rudimentary awareness of these seasons of spiritual life. But there's a deeper way you can evaluate your spiritual seasons and your life stages, and that's what I want to do in this video. So today, I want to introduce a spiritual framework that basically can help you evaluate 3 things. So first, where you currently stand in relation to God at a specific point in your life. Number 2, where someone else might stand in their walk with God. And number 3, how you might respond when you're in one of these specific seasons of life. So, before I get into the framework itself, I want to give 3 caveats to help anchor your perspective. So first, this framework is a tool to help you gauge your relationship with God and to also help evaluate those around you, your friends, your church members, etc., so that you can use better discernment to approach situations, relationships, and decisions. And second, this framework should both encourage you and rebuke you at the same time, but it shouldn't define you because all of us can be at different points of our lives with respect to our spiritual walk with God, but it's good to be aware of where you stand because you need to be moving towards God, towards growth, ultimately in a progression in sanctification. And third, this framework is referring to true believers who have a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. This framework isn't meant to evaluate those who are not Christian already. So with that, let me introduce to you the pillars of this framework. All right, so the first pillar is understanding God's love. So generally, when you think of a scale from low to high, the lower you are with regards to understanding God's love on the scale, the less aware or educated on Scripture you are, and consequently, your ability to practically apply Scripture to your life is weaker. Understanding the Bible, its context, how it relates to an individual's actions or life decisions, and the application to life is the first critical pillar in evaluating your spiritual life. So, the higher you are on understanding God's love, the more you are aware of your life circumstances, and better discerning Christ-like choices. So people higher on the scale will be able to correctly, discern a right-wrong decision, discern specific life situations, and will generally have a deeper biblical knowledge. The higher you go on the scale, the more, intellectual, the more knowledgeable one will become. And often these people can quote, Scripture like the back of their hand. So the second pillar is experiencing God's love. And, experiencing God's love means a person has a relationship with God. They're intimate with Him, continuously praying, seeking His presence, and obeying Him. And the higher they are on the scale, the more they desire to listen to Him and to discern how God speaks through the circumstances of life and, through Scripture, and that they genuinely desire to be around Him because they're experiencing what it means to be near Him. So conversely, the lower a person is in experiencing God's love, the more they are not in His presence. They, don't pray or fast as much, and often they believe that they are, content with what minimal relationship they have with God, or they often ignore this intimacy altogether, believing they already got, what they need. And so the third pillar is expressing God's love. So the higher a person is in this area, the more they are called to take action for the sake of others. They're well aware of the verse that states, faith without works is dead. They're able to express their love of God through some form of mercy ministry, evangelism, preparation for a calling, And in everyday life, they, seek to love others through whatever means necessary. So the higher they are on the scale, the more selfless, sacrificial, forgiving, merciful, graceful, and loving they are. And the people, or these people, also consistently desire to prepare and align themselves for a future call to action. So they desire to have a purpose in the world. And conversely, the lower a person is in expressing God's love, the less inclined they are to love others, to express their faith, and to step up to a call for action. Now, if you put it together, see that? This is representing your spiritual life on an XYZ axis, but with varying levels of flexibility on a high-low scale. And so the going up or down isn't necessarily measured by, like quantitative metrics like the number of people you reach out to, the number of hours you pray or read the Bible. Rather, it's a combination of your heart's condition and a subjective measure of maturity and outcome. Okay, that's a lot, but I can't really answer that in detail because it's complicated. But regardless, everyone is at, different points in their life, and it will constantly be a growth process till we die and ultimately meet Christ in heaven. So, rather you want to use this framework as an evaluation tool to see where you might critically understand where you might stand in relation to God. So now that we got that out of the way, let's get a little more specific and see what it means to be in a general low-high scale for each of these areas. So you can see there are 8 what I call spiritual personalities, and with distinct high-low features of each of these XYZ axis. For this video, I'm going to just skim through each of these quickly, but eventually I'd love to talk about each of these more in depth, and you'll probably have a lot of questions and thoughts, rebuttals even. I get it. It's meant to act as an evaluation tool, sort of like a personality test. So don't take these titles and labels to heart. If it rebukes you, fine. If you go out and change your legal middle name, then we have a problem. But it's also not that you're completely high or low on each scale. There are people that are in between each of these, high-low scales, and I don't have a complete answer for each of them. Again, that's okay. All right, so let's look at the first one. If you can imagine you just got saved, then you would be a newborn believer. You are high in experiencing God's love because He came into your heart. And this is also, commonly referred to as first love. And therefore, you are in a spiritual high. However, you lack in understanding of Scripture because you are new to it, meaning you are low on understanding God's love. And also, you lack purpose in doing kingdom work, but of course, you have potential. So therefore, you are, low in expressing God's love. You're probably not in this stage for very long because all you can do from here is grow towards, the second one, baby Christian, or to the third one, which I'll talk about in a minute. But this second one is what I like to call baby Christian. So as a baby Christian, they are compassionate, purposeful, and often love to speak about their newfound Christianity, so they're an evangelist. However, they decide to express God's love. The point is they're gung-ho about it, and they're still in a strong spiritual state of being in God's presence, and therefore high on experiencing God's love. However, you're low on understanding God's love because you still haven't fully studied or understood Scripture, which only comes with time, education, and continued personal devotionals. So the third one is what I call the Prodigal Son. Now, if you know the story in the Bible, basically it's the lost son who eventually comes back. But for the purposes of illustrating this example, it's basically describing the one who is low on all 3 areas. So, they ran away, rejected God's love. They've also rejected and I guess in a way forgot what Scripture is because they are not applying it to their life. And of course, they are in the world doing worldly, paganistic, sinful things. So it's very, very easy to understand this one. So the fourth one is Foundationless Philanthropist. So the main premise of this one is that they are high in expressing God's love, meaning they're very zealous and willing to outreach. They have a good Samaritan mentality but they're low on understanding God's love because they haven't been exposed as much to the Bible, or they don't do devotionals, or they don't strive to be nourished in the Word and in good theology. So they're also low in experiencing God's love because they don't have a prayer life. They go aimlessly doing good Samaritan things, but they lack a relationship with God. The fifth one is purpose seeker. And so as a purpose seeker, they are high in both experiencing God's love and understanding God's love, meaning they have a prayer life and they have a relationship with God, and they are connected. They're loving to others. They are even wise, perceptive, but they are low in expressing God's love because either they don't have a calling, or they are unsure or insecure in how to display their love, their gifts, and their talents to the people and the world around them. They may have faith, but they have no deeds. So it'll be difficult for these people to genuinely actually be in this stage for a long period of time, because if they truly have a deep relationship for God, then inevitably they would come out of this stage moving towards something more actionable. And so typically these people are going through a difficult time. They're just turning a corner. They're seeking answers in life after having gone through a refinement period. So being refined pure as gold, as it says in Scripture. So the sixth one is lukewarm Christian. So as a lukewarm Christian, you have mature doctrine, but you lost your first love. So you're high in understanding God's love, but low in both experiencing and expressing God's love. So you might be, a Sunday service Christian, as they call it, but your spiritual life is hanging by a thread and you lack a true relationship with God. So you're insecure. You're going off of what you know based on your knowledge of Scripture. So the seventh one is the Legalistic Pharisee. So here you have, you're high in understanding and expressing God's love, meaning you adhere to the rules and laws, and you have high standards for behavior in life, and you do things according to what you believe is right, which can often align to biblical doctrine, but because you are not doing it out of true love, grace, and mercy, you are judgmental and hypocritical and ingenuine, and that's because you are low in experiencing God's love, meaning you don't have a true relationship and connectedness with Him. So the eighth one is a Christ Emulator. This is where you are high in all three areas, and you ultimately have an amazing relationship with God because you are exhibiting all the traits of being as Christ-like as you can, but at the same level you're at. So if that makes sense. So basically, to each their own measure, based on where they are in their life. That's how they are for each of those areas. So you still have a long ways to go in terms of growth, because we can never truly be sinless until we get to heaven. But in terms of spiritual state, you are constantly balancing prayer, word, opportunities, and consequently you are fruitful and you're becoming more and more wise and experienced. So you're shameless for Christ and in this spiritual high. You are growing most rapidly than any other state because God is feeding you, enabling you, and activating you since you are obeying God and submitting to God. Okay, so these are all the main spiritual conditions that you could, reside in at a particular point in your life. And one thing to note is that in some of these, you don't stay in it very long. Naturally, you gravitate into a default kind of state. Newborn believers and purpose seekers are essentially transition states, while, a baby Christian inevitably moves towards something else. But for the other 5, you could be in that spiritual state for a very long period of time. All but 1 are conditions you don't really want to be in for too long. So, being in a certain condition isn't necessarily bad if God is allowing you to go through a period of time to train you and to grow you, but just be aware of where you might be and how you might want to progress towards Christ Emulator, which is the obvious one you want to be at. Again, nothing bad or condescending in any of these, but rather, hopefully this can be a tool or one tool to help you critically evaluate where you might be in your walk with Christ. So, I'll speak to more of these in detail, but for now, I'll leave it at this. So, thanks for listening, everybody. Hope it helps, and God bless.